In the United States, the right to vote is just that, a right, not a privilege. However, in the run-up to the November midterm elections, there has been a slew of legislation pushed through aiming to curtail what should be the right of every U.S. citizen to have their voice heard in electoral politics. Currently, there are a number of cases before the United States Supreme Court challenging measures that would undermine representation and participation of black people and other minorities if passed. Adding to that is the growing number of tactics being carried out on the ground right now that are suppressing people's access to the ballot. So what does this mean for U.S. democracy and the voting process? Joining us today is LaTosha Brown, co-founder of Black Voters Matter, Ari Berman, senior reporter at Mother Jones, and the author of Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America, and Sarah Brannon, managing attorney at the ACLU Voting Rights Project. Thank you all for joining us on UpFront. LaTosha, I'm going to start with you because you are in Georgia, which is a Republican stronghold reportedly, but it's a red state that's kind of turning into a battleground state. Black people there, though, are having to contend with some sweeping voting restrictions, and I'm trying to get an understanding here of what the state of things are in Georgia right now for black voters.
You know, as you said, people may recall that right after the 2020-2021 election, what we saw in the state legislature, there was a bill called SB 202, Senate Bill 202, that passed and was signed into law by the governor, who I call Brian Kemp, who was the voter suppression chief, I think, around the country. That part of what that bill did, and the short way of understanding is that there were components of that bill that, one, restricted access to the ballot, two, it literally weaponized the administrative process in such a way that the governor and Republican Party can actually challenge and take over election results if it's not to their liking. And the third thing that it does is creates this culture of fear by criminalizing organizations such as our own and others that are literally doing things like comfort care to provide just water, a pizza, and comfort care for people who've been standing in line for hours. And so it's like death by 1,000 cuts. So they've been using these different tactics to restrict access, to create this culture of fear, and to really be able to weaponize this administrative process. The good news is that what has happened in Georgia is that we've broken all kinds of records related to having more people to turn out for early voting. You know, the narrative from the Republicans is that, well, this proves that voter suppression doesn't work. The real narrative is that because of voter suppression, certain communities like the African American community is pissed off, and we've decided to organize ourselves. It's taken a tremendous amount of time, human capital, and resources to really be able to combat these barriers that have been placed up. And what we're seeing is that African American voters are literally making up, overperforming, that between the reports between 38 and 40% of the early voter African American voters.
Ari, I mean, the whole point of the 1965 Voting Rights Act was to prevent there from being barriers. I mean, constitutionally, black people and all citizens have the right to vote. But historically, things like poll taxes, grandfather clauses, all sorts of stuff stop black people in real life from being able to vote. 1965 Voting Rights Act says, okay, we'll stop this stuff. Now you have real representation, real access to the vote. And yet right now we're at a moment where it seems like for the third time, the legislation is being gutted. We're literally rebattling and relitigating the same battles that we fought 60 years ago. Walk me through, one, why this piece of legislation was so important, and two, how is it being struggled over now?
Well, that's absolutely right, Mark. We had decades of disenfranchisement in this country of Black Americans, really going back to the founding itself, when only white male property owners could vote. And then voting rights were steadily expanded, first for white men who didn't own property, and then dramatically expanded for black men with the passage of the 14th and the 15th Amendment. Then many of those rights were taken away. And it wasn't until the 1965 Voting Rights Act that everyone got the right to vote in this country, regardless of race or color. And that was a monumental achievement, because you had a situation where in states like Mississippi, only 6% of African Americans were registered to vote before the passage of the Voting Rights Act. You had counties in Alabama that were 80, 90% black, and there wasn't a single black registered voter before the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So it revolutionized American democracy. It made America a true democracy. For the first time, there have been efforts to try to chip away at it for years, but those efforts have dramatically accelerated in the past decade. And I think the reason why those efforts have dramatically accelerated in the past decade is because, number one, the Republican Party itself has radicalized against American democracy. But number two, they've taken over the courts. And the courts and the Congress were the two entities that always protected the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act was reauthorized 4 times by the Congress. And it was also that those reauthorizations were all signed by Republican presidents. So there was a broad bipartisan consensus for the Voting Rights Act for many years. But Republicans have now turned against the Voting Rights Act. And in particular, the Supreme Court, with 5 and then now 6 conservative justices, has dramatically weakened the Voting Rights Act. In 2021, they severely weakened the law, made it harder to strike down discriminatory voting changes. And now they're basically on the verge of legalizing racial gerrymandering. So the combination of Republicans turning against the Voting Rights Act and then capturing the courts and weakening the Voting Rights Act has left it in a very perilous position.
You mentioned gerrymandering. I want to go there. LaTosha, I know you have a lot of expertise in this, but Sarah, I want to bring you in first on this.
Sure.
Because what's happening in places is they're literally redrawing districts so that black people, their vote counts, but there's no powerful black voting bloc. They're basically diluting the black vote. There's a case, Merrill versus Milligan in Alabama, where we're seeing this very thing. And the argument from Republicans seems to be, well, we're supposed to be colorblind. So there is no black vote. It's just votes. All votes matter.
Yes.
Right? So how do you make sense of this? How can we resist this narrative? And how dangerous is it?
So we're very worried about the Supreme Court case, which is Merrill versus Milligan, which is the Alabama redistricting case. I think it's worth noting that the Alabama legislature drew the Alabama maps, and in the congressional map, a 3-judge panel, which included 2 Trump appointees, unanimously ruled that the congressional map in Alabama violated the Voting Rights Act. And part of the reason to understand it is exactly what you're saying, which is the map that they drew, the state legislature drew, really packs and cracks is the words that we use to describe it. So they put all of the African-American populations in sort of all together in one district instead of really drawing maps that reflect where black people live in Alabama. So what happened in Alabama is after that decision was issued, the Supreme Court stayed that decision and then took the case up, which they recently heard oral arguments on that case in early October. And the concern is that the U.S. Supreme Court is going to undermine that ruling, undermine the Voting Rights Act, undermine the Voting Rights Act, which has been incredibly successful when you talk about redistricting and vote dilution to sort of ensure and protect and make sure that minority voters, black voters, get equal opportunities to elect candidates of their choice.
Is that a persuasive argument, Ari? Not to you, but perhaps to the courts in your anticipation, that voting is race neutral, that every vote should count, but that black people don't have a right to elect black candidates, or that, you know, as long as your vote counts in this district or that district, it shouldn't matter where it counts. I mean, this is what the Republican legislatures are arguing.
Yeah, I mean, and the thing is, it doesn't really matter what we think. It just matters what 5 conservative justices on the Supreme Court think. And so clearly they think that that's going to be an appealing argument to them. You have to go back, though, because this argument has been made by Republicans for decades, that basically the Voting Rights Act was becoming a form of affirmative action in the electoral sphere. And it's been made more aggressively by Republicans in the last redistricting cycle, and they've taken some really dramatic steps. In Florida, for example, in the maps that were put forward by the governor, Ron DeSantis, which in and of itself was extraordinary because the governor's not supposed to control redistricting, they just flat out dismantled majority black districts in a way that was clearly thought to violate the Voting Rights Act. Southern states have very clearly diluted the power of black votes to deny them representation. So you're not saying one group should be favored over another. You're just saying that the group should have equal access to the political process. And it doesn't really make sense in a state like Alabama, which is over a quarter black, that they would only control 1 of 7 districts, or that in a state like Florida, there could be no black representatives or very few black representatives after this redistricting cycle is done. So I don't think it's about special treatment. It's about everyone treated the same. And right now, white Republicans in states like Alabama are being treated differently, more advantageously than black Democrats are, black voters writ large, because black voters are much more likely to associate with the Democrats. So I think on the merits of the case, it's pretty clear. That's why they won in the lower courts, as Sarah said. But I think you have a Supreme Court that is extremely ideological when it comes to the Voting Rights Act, and they're going to find a way to rule in favor of Alabama if that's what they want to do.
There's another piece to this, LaTosha, that I want to talk about, which is the actual voter suppression bill. Since January of 2021, there have been 400 restrictive bills introduced into legislatures around the country. That is a stunning number. There are those that would point at this being part of a larger kind of racial backlash against the black community and minorities. There is a fear of black political power that is motivating Jim Crow era voting restrictions, some would argue. We're seeing efforts to criminalize. We see people who have food and water. We see the lines get longer. We've seen fewer voting locations. I mean, it seems to me that this could have a material impact on the midterm elections. If black people have it harder to vote, then it's going to be harder for their vote to count.
This has a material election on literally not just on black voters, but it actually unravels democracy, that we have to really recognize the fragility of democracy that we're dealing with right now. So I can talk about Georgia. I can also talk about Florida, where DeSantis has actually created a police force, essentially to actually be an intimidation tool for voters there. There's one voter who was a formerly incarcerated returning citizen who had registered to vote because his county said that he could register to vote. He was awakened one morning at 5 o'clock in the morning with a SWAT team at his door and a helicopter over his house and police in his backyard. That is at its most. That is not only traumatizing and intimidation, but really when we look at it, those are signs of fascism. We have to really recognize what we're up against. This is not just another election around the Democrats and the Republicans. We're literally in an election that we are determining what is the future of democracy in this country. Not just whether black people can vote, but whether people can vote who may or may not have the same opinion as those that are in power. Will we have free and fair access? Will we have a system that people are not punished because they participated in the election?
So, Sarah, there's a way that we've talked about this along racial lines. But in this country, it's also more difficult for trans folk to vote, disabled folk to vote, non-English speaking people to vote, poor and working class people to vote. I mean, structurally, it seems to me that the most vulnerable in society have it hardest when it comes to accessing one of the very things that might make their lives easier, right, which is access to the democratic process. Is this a new thing, or have we historically always made it harder for all these vulnerable groups to vote?
I think there has been some history of always making it harder for these vulnerable groups to vote, but I think it's a fair assessment to say that it has gotten worse in recent history in the last 10 years. I think one thing to understand about it is, and comes up particularly in Georgia, was the early vote is a good example, which is that as we as a society have modernized in our technology and our access to try and figure out how to do things, there's great opportunities. Early voting, registering to vote online, automatic voter registration, just all of these ideas that vote by mail. It's a really good example, that take advantage of some of the technology advances we have as a society. And in some places, there's a lot of effort to try and implement those improvements to make it easier for everybody to vote, particularly people of color, people who are lower income, people who have disabilities and need more assistance with voting, people who have, our English is not their first language. We have the capacity to help those people participate in numbers that reflect who they are and how they fit in our populace. But the response of Republican legislators and unfortunately of some of our courts is to discourage those modernizations.
Ari, another group that faces these challenges, these systemic barriers, is the Native American community. I mean, you see lack of access to ballot boxes. You see Native American citizens being rendered ineligible voters, sometimes because they don't have standard street addresses, which of course is very common if you live on a reservation, for example. Talk to me about the obstacles that Native American populations experience and why there are so many of them.
Huge obstacles to Native Americans voting. First off, they often live in more remote places, particularly on reservations. And I don't want to say that everyone does, but obviously in places like North Dakota, for example, and the Navajo Nation, people could live very far from a polling place. There were efforts, for example, to help people drop off their mail ballots because polling places were far away. Those efforts have been cut down. There were efforts so that they could register to vote on election day because registration can be difficult in these areas. Those efforts were cut down. There were tribal IDs that they could use for anything in their lives, but the law was written in such a way that you had to have addresses on your IDs, and there were no addresses on some of the reservations, so then you couldn't vote with your tribal IDs. That was an issue we saw in North Dakota a few elections ago. So I think Sarah is absolutely right that groups that are historically disenfranchised, that are historically marginalized, that have other socioeconomic difficulties, those play out when it comes to the voting process. And those are a lot of the same issues that are facing Native American communities, where it's not just that they lack access to voting, is that there's other issues that they have in their lives that are manifested by not having easy access to voting. And then the laws have been written in such a way to target those voters because Native American voters are also a constituency that tends to favor Democrats in places like North Dakota, in places like Arizona. It doesn't get talked about a lot. It's not a group that's mentioned very often. But for example, in Arizona, the Navajo Nation is going to play a very important role in the outcome of that election. And so I think you're absolutely right. And it's very good that you brought up those barriers because they're often overlooked.
Sarah, there's a legal theory that's been gaining traction with some Republicans. Now, I'm going to stipulate that this is fringe theory we're talking about here. The independent state legislature theory, or the ISL, is the idea that the state legislature has preeminent power over other parts of a state's legal process, including the ability to override a governor veto or state court decisions. Now, while some would argue that this is an obscure theory, there is a pro-ISL case before the Supreme Court right now. Should people be worried about the push to kind of decentralize power and give states the last word?
Yes.
Okay.
So, and so I think it's important to understand.
That was a quick yes, because I actually was expecting you to say something quite different. I mean, I was hoping you'd say something quite different.
No, I think there's reasons to be worried. Mm-hmm. So the current case that's before the Supreme Court that oral argument will be heard in December is out of North Carolina. The North Carolina state constitution has a very clear protection of the right to vote and an inherent history in the case law in North Carolina that there should not be partisan gerrymandering. So, of course, the Republican legislature in North Carolina drew both the state legislative map and the congressional maps very partisanly gerrymandered. There was successful litigation. The North Carolina Supreme Court agreed. This is the state Supreme Court agreed that those maps violated the North Carolina state constitution and violated the right to vote in the state of North Carolina because they were so partisanly gerrymandered, and demanded that the legislature draw new maps. So there are actually new congressional maps. There's a new state legislative map. Those will actually be in effect in November. But the Republican legislature appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which then took the case. And they're making the argument based on provision of the U.S. Constitution that has never been interpreted to mean this, that the state legislature is the one that should have the final word on all things related to voting. So your state Supreme Court, your state constitution would have no impact. So what that would do...
This feels so obviously absurd.
Yes, and it would create completely unchecked power in the state legislature.
We're making an ideological and political process, partisan process even, rather than...
And totally completely opposite of the concept in American government, which is both true in the state and federal level, of balance of powers, that you should have more than one institution, courts, a governor, a legislature making these decisions, and that is how we get to the fairest and best place in most circumstances. And the fact that the U.S. Supreme Court has even entertained this argument and is now having an oral argument and has said they're going to entertain this particular concept is very concerning. Because
concerning is an extravagant understatement. It's terrifying. Ari, we're seeing a lot of legislation enabling voter suppression, but some are still hoping for a big voter turnout, especially from young people, in light of the overturning of Roe v. Wade. How important is the youth vote to the midterm elections?
Very important, particularly in a midterm election, because the fact is a lot of young voters just don't turn out in a midterm election. A lot of people just don't turn out, period, in a midterm election. I mean, we're going to see probably less than 50% of Americans turn out in this next election. And we're going to see even lower turnout among younger voters, because that's just what happens. People get really excited about the presidential election, and they're much less excited over who the governor might be, or who the Secretary of State might be, or who the Attorney General be, or who their member of Congress might be, even though those things are extremely important and in some cases affect their lives more than who the president is. And so I think there is a growing realization that rights can be taken away in this country. And I think Roe v. Wade was an extremely illuminating moment for a lot of younger people who thought, we'll always have reproductive rights. I'll always have a right to control what happens with my own body. And now they don't, not just because of the Supreme Court, but the fact that so many states immediately criminalized abortion in a way that was unthinkable. In Wisconsin, for example, there's an abortion ban from 1849. That's 1 year after Wisconsin became a state. That immediately went into effect after Roe v. Wade was overturned. It makes no exceptions for rape or incest. It's totally out of step with what voters in Wisconsin want. And so I hope this will be an illuminating moment for younger people to get out and defend those rights. But my concern is that not enough people are paying attention to midterm elections, not enough people are paying attention to what state races do, and not enough people are connecting the value of their vote to change. But I think there's a frustration here that Democrats have to address in terms of getting people to vote, particularly younger people.
So I want you all to help me look forward a bit. You know, given all of the voting issues, given all the attacks on the Voting Rights Act, what are we looking at beyond midterms? And other than the court fights, which are essential, what should individuals be doing to protect voting rights?
So I think, advocating to your local and state officials, because they're the ones that really control a lot of elections, and that's going to be true, unfortunately, more and more as the courts are less of an avenue. So I think one thing you can do that's really important is to pay attention to these issues, as Ari says, to make sure that you're voting, to make sure that you're paying attention to the impact that your votes have, both in midterms and but also in some of your local state elections, because that's really important in terms of determining who is actually making decisions about how elections are run within your state. And that's where some of these decisions come from. And so I think it's fundamentally important. I mean, people need to pay attention and understand that there are consequences for voting, to understand that.
And more importantly, consequences for not voting.
Yeah, right? Yes, consequences for not voting.
Absolutely. All right, what say you?
Well, I think Sarah is absolutely right that I think first it starts with voting in these elections, because these elections are going to shape American democracy for years to come. I mean, the question we're facing now is, will people who don't believe in free and fair elections be elected to take over our election system? And that is an extremely frightening process. So I think first it starts with voting, but then it starts with deeper structural change. I mean, the fact is Democrats would have been able to pass these voting rights bills if they had modified the filibuster. They refused to do so. So that's really not just on Republicans, it's on them for not doing it. And that's why we need structural change in this country to make our institutions more reflective. Because whether it's gerrymandered state legislatures, whether it's the structure of the U.S. Senate, whether it's the Electoral College, too often there's very popular support for certain policies, but those policies don't become law because they're able to be blocked by a much smaller minority of Americans, or the way our institutions are structured. So I'm very concerned not just about what's going to happen this next election, but are our institutions going to be moved in a way that's more and more undemocratic? And that's why I think we need a more long-term movement for deeper structural change in this country as well.
LaTosha, you're on the ground. You talk to the people all the time. What should individuals be doing to act to help change these circumstances we're in?
So I say three things. One, I call it the 3 R's. They've got to respond, which means you've got to respond to what is happening right now. If you're not registered, you need to register to vote. If you are registered voter, you have to respond by literally making sure that you go out and vote, and you get other people to vote with you. That this isn't a moment to stand on the sidelines, that there are consequences that will have long-lasting effects on our community. The second thing is we've got to resist. It has to be completely unacceptable that any national party in this country can align itself with white nationalists and it can be okay. They have to feel consequences. We have to recognize this isn't just about a policy difference. This isn't just about party power. This is really around us sending a message loud and clear that white nationalism will not be tolerated in any form. And the third thing we have to do is we have to radically reimagine. What do I mean by that? That it's not okay just for us to really continue to engage as we're engaging right now. Yes, we've got to vote. Yes, we've got to organize, but that's not enough. What we have to to do is radically reimagine every single system in this country, recognize that it was all formed out in a context of white racist patriarchy, and that we've got to create systems that are literally going to be designed to be inclusive and to create us, to get us to a more reflective and representative democracy. So those are the things that we have to do. We have to respond, we have to resist, and we have to reimagine.
LaTosha, Ari, Sarah, thank you so much for joining me. This has been a great conversation. Everybody, that is our show. Up Front, we'll be back next week.